The small town of Maplewood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Life moved at a slow pace and nothing much ever happened to shake things up. That is, until the new teacher arrived. On a crisp Monday morning, the school buzzed, with excitement, or maybe it was just gossip. A tall, broad-shouldered man walked into Maplewood High for the first time. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that made people stop and take notice. His warm smile softened his strong presence, but there was something about him that said, "Don't mess with me." This wasn't just any teacher. He was one of only 2 black teachers in the entire school, and his arrival felt like a big deal. Some students were curious, others intrigued, but not everyone was happy about it. Among the sea of faces staring back at him during roll call, 3 stood out. They weren't the kind of kids you'd want to cross paths with after dark, or even in broad daylight for that matter. These 3 seniors had a reputation. They ruled the hallways with smirks and swagger, picking on anyone who looked different or seemed weak. To them, this new guy wasn't just another teacher. He was fresh meat. Their leader, a lanky kid with shaggy hair and a permanent scowl, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Next to him sat a shorter, stockier boy who cracked his knuckles whenever he got bored. The third, a wiry guy with sharp features, kept glancing at the clock like he couldn't wait to get out of there. None of them paid attention to what the teacher was saying. Instead, they whispered among themselves, snickering under their breath. The teacher didn't seem fazed. In fact, he barely acknowledged them. He went about introducing himself, writing his name on the board in clean, bold letters. Mr. Isaiah Johnson. As he spoke, his voice filled the room, calm but firm. "I'm here to teach history," he said, turning to face the class. "But more importantly, I'm here to help you understand how the past shapes our future. If you're willing to put in the effort, I promise you'll leave this classroom knowing more than just dates and names." While most of the students scribbled notes or nodded along, the trio in the back exchanged skeptical looks. "Yeah, right," muttered the stocky one. "Like we care about some old dead guys." The comment earned a few chuckles from nearby classmates, but Isaiah didn't react. He simply continued teaching, making eye contact with each student, including the troublemakers. It was almost as if he was daring them to try something. By lunchtime, word had spread around school. The bullies weren't fans of the new teacher, and they weren't shy about letting people know. "He thinks he's tough," the lanky one said loudly in the cafeteria, jabbing a fork into his tray of mashed potatoes. "We'll see about that." His friends grinned, egging him on. By the end of the day, rumors were flying that the 3 planned to give Isaiah a welcome gift after school, a little reminder of who really ran the show. Isaiah, meanwhile, didn't seem concerned. After the final bell rang, he stayed, behind in his classroom, organizing papers and setting up lesson plans for the week. If he heard the murmurs outside his door, or noticed the shadowy figures lingering in the hallway, he gave no sign of it. He worked steadily, humming softly to himself as the minutes ticked by. But deep down, he knew trouble was coming. And truth be told, he'd been expecting it. Growing up, Isaiah had faced his fair share of challenges. Being the new kid in town, standing out because of the color of his skin, dealing with people who judged him before getting to know him, it wasn't easy. But those experiences taught him resilience. They also taught him how to defend himself both physically and mentally. Over the years, he'd trained in martial arts, learning not just how to fight, but when not to. He believed in using strength, wisely, choosing restraint over aggression whenever possible. Still, he understood that sometimes showing restraint wasn't enough. Sometimes people needed to see action to truly grasp the message. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the emptying school, Isaiah heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching. 3 pairs of boots thudded against the tiled floor, growing louder with each step. Then came the slam of the classroom door as it swung shut with unnecessary force. Isaiah glanced up, pretending to be surprised. There they were, the same 3 boys from earlier, standing, shoulder to shoulder, blocking the exit. Their expressions were smug, confident. They thought they had the upper hand. "So," the lanky one drawled, cracking his neck dramatically. "You think you're all that, huh?" coming in here like you own the place. Isaiah set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, meeting their gazes one by one. I don't think I own anything, he replied evenly. But I do expect respect from my students and from anyone else who walks through that door. The stocky boy snorted. Respect? You gotta earn that, buddy. Isaiah raised an eyebrow. And how exactly does one earn respect around here? Without warning, the wiry one lunged forward, aiming to shove Isaiah backward. But instead of stumbling, Isaiah shifted smoothly to the side, dodging the attack with ease. Before the boy could recover, Isaiah grabbed his arm, twisting it gently but firmly behind his back. The move was so quick, so precise, that the other two froze in shock. Now, Isaiah said calmly, looking directly at the remaining pair. Who's next? The tension in the room was electric. For the first time, the bullies realized they might have bitten off more than they could chew. The air in the classroom felt thick, like it was hard to breathe. The wiry boy struggled against Isaiah's grip, his face flushed with embarrassment and panic. He tried to pull away, but Isaiah held firm, not too tight to hurt, but enough to make it clear he was in control. The other two bullies stood frozen, their earlier bravado crumbling faster than a sandcastle in the rain. You think this is fun? Isaiah asked, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. You think pushing people around makes you tough? Let me tell you something. Real strength isn't about throwing your weight around. It's about knowing when not to. The lanky leader clenched his fists, trying to muster some courage. Let him go, he barked, though his voice wavered slightly. Or else? Or else what? Isaiah shot back, his tone steady. You'll hit me? Go ahead. Try it. For a moment, nobody moved. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, without warning, the stocky boy charged forward, aiming a wild swing at Isaiah. But Isaiah saw it coming. With one fluid motion, he sidestepped the punch, using the momentum of the attacker to send him stumbling past. Before the boy could regain his balance, Isaiah gently swept his leg out from under him, sending him crashing to the floor with a thud. 2 down, Isaiah said, glancing over at the last bully still standing, the lanky one. Your turn. Bye. Now the wiry boy had stopped struggling. His breathing came in short gasps, and his eyes darted between Isaiah and his fallen friends. Meanwhile, the lanky leader looked like a deer caught in headlights. For all his talk, he hadn't expected things to go this way. He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, unsure whether to fight or flee. Isaiah didn't rush him. Instead, he straightened up, releasing the wiry boy completely. Look, he said, crossing his arms, I don't want to hurt anyone. But if you keep coming at me, I'm not going to just stand here and take it. You made your move. Now it's my turn to respond. That seemed to snap the lanky boy out of his daze. He took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to throw another clumsy punch. This time, Isaiah didn't even dodge. He simply caught the boy's wrist, mid-swing, twisting it gently but firmly until the kid yelped in surprise. In less than a second, the lanky leader found himself kneeling on the ground, his arm pinned behind his back. Had enough? Isaiah asked, his tone neutral but firm. The boy nodded frantically, sweat dripping down his forehead. Yeah. Okay, just let me go. Isaiah released him slowly, stepping back to give all 3 boys space. They scrambled to their feet, looking equal parts terrified and humiliated. None of them dared to meet his gaze as they brushed themselves off, their earlier cockiness replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. You're lucky I didn't decide to teach you a harder lesson, Isaiah said, his voice quieter now but no less commanding. Because believe me, I could have, but I'm giving you a chance to walk away and think about what just happened. Next time, don't pick fights you can't win. Without another word, the 3 boys bolted for the door, nearly tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Once outside, they didn't stop running until they were far away from the classroom, their hearts pounding and their egos bruised beyond repair. Back inside, Isaiah let out a slow breath, leaning against his desk. He wasn't out of breath, not even close, but the confrontation had taken its toll. Not physically, but mentally. He'd been in situations like this before, where someone underestimated him because of how he looked or where he came from. And while he hated having to prove himself this way, he knew it was sometimes necessary. People only respected boundaries when they understood there were consequences for crossing them. As he tidied up the classroom, Isaiah couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the boys come back for revenge? Or would they learn something from the experience? Either way, he knew the ripple effects of what had just happened wouldn't stay confined to those four walls. News traveled fast in a small town like Maplewood, especially in a high school filled with curious teenagers. By morning, everyone would know what went down, and opinions would be divided. Some students might cheer him on, seeing him as a hero who finally stood up to the bullies. Others might worry that the troublemakers would retaliate, making life harder for everyone. And then there were the teachers and staff members who would undoubtedly have their own thoughts. Principal Reynolds, for instance, valued order above all else. She'd probably call him into her office tomorrow, asking for an explanation while reminding him to tread carefully. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that Isaiah had drawn a line in the sand, a boundary that said, "This, far and no further." Whether the boys chose to respect it remained to be seen. Still, Isaiah hoped they'd take the lesson to heart. After all, teaching wasn't just about history lessons and grades. It was about shaping character, helping young people grow into better versions of themselves. If tonight's encounter helped plant even a tiny seed of change in those boys' minds, then maybe it was worth it. As Isaiah locked up the classroom and headed home, the halls of Maplewood High grew eerily silent. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the empty corridors. Somewhere in the distance, a janitor's mop swished rhythmically against the tiled floor. Outside, the cool night air greeted him, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass. For a moment, Isaiah allowed himself to relax, letting the peacefulness of the evening wash over him. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and possibly even more resistance. Yet Isaiah was ready. He'd faced tougher battles than this before, both in and out of the classroom. And if there was one thing he'd learned along the way, it was that true strength wasn't about winning fights. It was about staying true to yourself no matter what. By the time Isaiah reached home that evening, word of what had happened in the classroom was already spreading like wildfire. Maplewood wasn't the kind of town where secrets stayed buried for long, and a story as dramatic as this one practically begged to be told. By morning, nearly every student and quite a few teachers knew about the new history teacher who had single-handedly taken down three of the school's most notorious troublemakers. The next day at school, Isaiah could feel the shift in the atmosphere. As he walked through the hallways, heads turned to follow him. Some students whispered behind cupped hands, others stared openly, their expressions ranging from admiration to disbelief. A group of freshmen even parted like the Red Sea when he passed by, as if afraid to get too close. It was clear that the events of the previous afternoon had left an impression, one that would linger for days, maybe even weeks. But not everyone was thrilled. Principal Reynolds called Isaiah into her office before first period, her face unreadable as she gestured for him to sit. "I heard about yesterday," she began, folding her hands on the desk. Her tone was measured, professional, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Care to explain?" Isaiah leaned back in his chair, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "It's pretty simple," he said. "3 students decided to test me after school. They thought they could intimidate me. I showed them otherwise." Reynolds sighed, rubbing her temples. "You handled yourself well, I'll give you that. But you know how things work around here. Those boys have influence. If they decide to retaliate, it could cause problems for everyone." "I understand your concerns," Isaiah replied calmly. "But I also believe in setting boundaries. If we let behavior like that slide, it sends the wrong message to them and to the rest of the school." The principal nodded slowly, clearly torn. On one hand, she appreciated Isaiah's ability to command respect. On the other, she worried about potential fallout. "Just tread carefully," she said finally. We can't afford another incident. Back in the classroom, Isaiah tried to focus on teaching as usual. He greeted his students warmly, diving into a lesson about the civil rights movement, a topic that resonated deeply with him. Yet, despite his best efforts, he couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension in the room. The bullies weren't present, they'd skipped class altogether, but their absence only added to the unease. Students exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what might happen next. During lunch, Isaiah found himself surrounded by curious colleagues in the faculty lounge. Mrs. Peterson, the art teacher, leaned in conspiratorially. "So is it true?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Did you really take on those 3 boys all by yourself?" Isaiah chuckled softly, sipping his coffee. "It's true, but it wasn't about taking them on. It was about showing them that actions have consequences." Mr. Harris, the gym coach, clapped him on the shoulder. "Good for you, man. Someone needed to put those kids in their place. They've been running wild for years." While the support was encouraging, Isaiah knew it wouldn't shield him from criticism. Sure enough, later that afternoon, a few skeptical teachers pulled him aside, cautioning him against being too confrontational. "You're new here," one of them said. "People are watching. Don't let this become a pattern." Isaiah listened, patiently, nodding along. He understood their perspective, but he also knew that avoiding conflict wasn't the answer. Sometimes standing your ground was the only way to gain respect, not just from others, but from yourself. As the day wore on, something unexpected began to happen. Students who had once avoided eye contact or slouched in the back of the room now sat up straighter, paying closer attention during lessons. Even the quieter kids seemed more engaged, raising their hands to ask questions or offering thoughtful answers. It was as if the confrontation had sparked a change, not just in the bullies, but in the entire dynamic of the classroom. One particularly memorable moment came during 6th period, when a shy sophomore named Alex hesitantly approached Isaiah after class. Thank you," he mumbled, shuffling his feet, "for standing up to them. No one else ever has." Isaiah smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me," he said, "but I hope it reminds you that you deserve respect too. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Alex nodded, his cheeks flushing with gratitude before he hurried off to his next class. Moments like these reminded Isaiah why he became a teacher in the first place, not just to teach facts and figures, but to inspire courage and resilience in his students. Meanwhile, the bullies were laying low, for now. They avoided Isaiah's classes, skipping whenever possible and ducking into side corridors to steer clear of him in the hallways. Rumors swirled about what they might do next. Would they try to exact revenge? Or had the encounter shaken them enough to reconsider their behavior? Some students claimed to have seen them sulking in the cafeteria, picking at their food without cracking jokes or harassing anyone. Others reported overhearing muttered apologies directed at younger kids they'd previously targeted. Whether these changes were genuine or temporary remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. The power dynamic had shifted. For the first time in years, the bullies weren't calling the shots. That evening, as Isaiah prepared for bed, he reflected on everything that had transpired. Teaching wasn't easy, not in a place like Maplewood where old habits and prejudices often ran deep. But moments like today reminded him why he kept going. Every student deserved a chance to learn in an environment free from fear and intimidation. And if standing up to a few troublemakers helped create that space, then so be it. Still, Isaiah knew better than to let his guard down completely. In a town like this, challenges rarely ended cleanly. There would always be obstacles, both big and small. But as long as he stayed true to his principles, he believed he could navigate whatever came his way. With that thought, he turned off the light, letting the quiet of the night settle over him. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own victories, and Isaiah was ready to face them head-on. The days that followed the incident in the classroom were unlike anything Maplewood High had seen before. The school seemed to exist in a strange limbo, caught between awe and uncertainty. On one hand, students buzzed with excitement, whispering about how the new teacher had stood up to the bullies. On the other hand, there was an underlying tension, a sense that something big might still be brewing beneath the surface. For Isaiah, life went on as usual. He arrived at school each morning, with his usual calm demeanor, greeting students by name and diving into lessons with enthusiasm. But he couldn't ignore the subtle shifts happening around him. In the hallways, groups of kids who used to scatter at the sight of the troublemakers now walked with their heads held higher. Even the quieter students, the ones who typically faded into the background, started speaking up more in class. It was as if the confrontation had cracked open a door that had been closed for years, one that led to a world where respect wasn't something you demanded, but earned. Still, Isaiah knew it wouldn't last forever. Change rarely came without resistance, especially in a place like Maplewood. So when Friday afternoon rolled around and he noticed a familiar figure lingering near the doorway of his classroom, he wasn't entirely surprised. It was the lanky boy, the ringleader of the trio, who stood awkwardly just outside the room, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie and his eyes darted nervously around the empty hallway. When their gazes finally met, the boy hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "Can I talk to you?" he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. His voice was barely above a whisper, almost drowned out by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Isaiah set down the stack of papers he'd been grading and gestured toward a chair. "Sure," he said evenly. "Have a seat." The boy shuffled over and sat down, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Isaiah waited patiently, giving him time to gather his thoughts. Finally, the boy took a deep breath and blurted out, "I'm sorry about what happened. We were wrong to mess with you." Isaiah raised an eyebrow, studying the young man before him. There was no trace of the cocky attitude or swagger that had defined him just days earlier. Instead, he looked unsure, almost vulnerable. "Why are you apologizing now?" Isaiah asked gently. "What made you change your mind?" The boy shrugged, staring at his hands. "Because nobody's ever stood up to us like that. You didn't yell or freak out or call the principal. You just handled it. And honestly, it made me realize how much of a jerk I've been. To you, to everyone." Isaiah leaned back in his chair, considering the confession. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Kids who acted tough because they didn't know any other way to cope with their insecurities or frustrations. Deep down, many of them weren't bad people. They were just lost, trying to find their place in a world that often felt confusing and overwhelming. "Apology accepted," Isaiah said after a pause. His tone was firm, but not unkind. "But remember, words are easy. Actions speak louder. Show me, and your classmates, that you mean it." The boy nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. "I will. I promise." Over the next few weeks, Isaiah kept a close eye on the three boys. At first, they kept their distance, staying out of trouble and avoiding any situation that might put them in the spotlight. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to change. They started showing up to class more regularly, sitting quietly in the back instead of disrupting lessons. They even volunteered to help clean up the gym after basketball practice, a task they would have scoffed at just months earlier. Their transformation didn't go unnoticed. Other students whispered about it in the hallways, marveling at how different the trio seemed. Some were skeptical, convinced it was all an act. Others, however, saw it as proof that people could change, if given the right push. One particularly memorable moment came during a school assembly honoring community service projects. The stocky boy, one of the three troublemakers, stood nervously at the front of the auditorium, holding a certificate for volunteering at a local food bank. His cheeks flushed red as Principal Reynolds called him up to accept the award, and the applause that followed was hesitant at first, but grew louder as the audience realized what it meant. Later that day, Isaiah bumped into the boy in the hallway. "Congratulations," he said with a small smile. "Looks like you're making some real progress." The boy grinned sheepishly, scratching the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, thanks for not giving up on us." As the semester wore on, the changes at Maplewood High became impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the school shifted, becoming less tense and more collaborative. Students who had once feared the bullies now felt emboldened to stand up for themselves. Teachers reported fewer disciplinary issues and attendance rates began to climb. It wasn't perfect, there were still rough patches and setbacks, but the overall trend was undeniable. Principal Reynolds pulled Isaiah aside one afternoon, her expression softer than usual. "You've done something remarkable here," she admitted. "I wasn't sure about you at first, but now, I think you might be exactly what this school needed." Isaiah chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not just me. The students did the hard work. All I did was give them a nudge in the right direction." Reynolds smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "Don't sell yourself short. Sometimes a nudge is all it takes." By the end of the year, Maplewood High was a different place. The bullies, once feared and untouchable, had become unlikely role models, mentoring younger students and organizing fundraisers for local charities. Their journey wasn't smooth or linear, but it was genuine. And while Isaiah knew they still had a long way to go, he couldn't help but feel proud of the progress they'd made. For Isaiah, teaching had always been about more than just academics. It was about helping students discover their potential, showing them that they were capable of more than they thought possible. The events of the past few months had reminded him of why he loved his job and why he kept coming back year after year. As he packed up his classroom on the final day of school, Isaiah paused to glance around the empty room. The desks were neatly arranged, the chalkboard wiped clean, and the clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, the sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air as students celebrated the start of summer break. Isaiah smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He didn't know what the future held for him or for the students, but he knew one thing for certain: change was possible. All it took was courage, patience, and a willingness to believe in people, even when they didn't believe in themselves. With that thought, he turned off the light and closed the door behind him, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. By the time the school year came to a close, Maplewood High felt like a different place entirely. The once oppressive shadow cast by the bullies had lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of hope and possibility. Students who had spent years shrinking into the background now walked with confidence, their laughter echoing through the hallways. Teachers noticed it too, a shift in energy, a spark that hadn't been there before. And at the center of it all was Isaiah, the man who had unknowingly become more than just a teacher. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that strength wasn't about domination but about standing firm when it mattered most. The transformation of the three former troublemakers was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. They weren't perfect. They still joked around and occasionally pushed boundaries, but they were trying. For the first time in their lives, they seemed to understand the weight of their actions and how those actions affected others. It wasn't just about avoiding trouble anymore. It was about making amends and finding purpose. One crisp spring morning, Isaiah found himself sitting across from the wiry boy, the one who had lunged at him during that fateful confrontation months ago. This time, though, there was no tension between them. Instead, the boy looked earnest, almost eager as he spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady despite the nervous tapping of his foot against the floor, "about what you said that day. About real strength being about control and respect. I want to keep doing better, not just for me, but for everyone else." Isaiah nodded, leaning forward slightly. "That's a good start," he replied. "But remember, it's not enough to say it. You have to live it every day." The boy swallowed hard, nodding back. "I know. And I'm going to try. Promise." As the weeks went on, the ripple effects of their efforts became impossible to ignore. The trio started taking initiative in ways no one expected. They organized a school-wide cleanup drive, rallying classmates to pick up trash around the campus. They helped paint over graffiti in the parking lot, turning dull concrete walls into vibrant murals filled with quotes about perseverance and unity. One afternoon, Isaiah even caught them tutoring a group of struggling freshmen in math, a subject none of them had ever shown interest in before. Their peers noticed, of course. At first, skepticism lingered. Some students whispered behind their backs, convinced the changes were temporary or fake. But as the months passed, doubt gave way to admiration. Slowly but surely, the boys earned back the trust they'd lost, not because they demanded it, but because they worked for it. During a particularly memorable senior assembly, the lanky leader stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges tightly as he addressed the entire student body. His voice trembled at first, but as he continued, it grew stronger. "I'm not going to lie," he admitted, looking out at the sea of faces. "For a long time, I thought respect meant scaring people into doing what I wanted. Turns out that's not respect at all. That's fear. Real respect is something you earn, not by pushing people down, but by lifting them up. And I owe a lot of that lesson to Mr. Johnson." He paused, glancing toward Isaiah, who sat quietly in the front row. The room erupted into applause, louder and more heartfelt than anyone could have anticipated. For a moment, the lanky boy looked overwhelmed, blinking back tears before stepping away from the microphone. Principal Reynolds watched the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and relief. She approached Isaiah afterward, her expression softening as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done something extraordinary here," she said simply. "This school needed someone like you." Isaiah chuckled, shaking his head. "It wasn't just me," he insisted. "These kids chose to change. All I did was give them a chance to see another path." Reynolds smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "Sometimes giving someone a chance is the hardest thing we can do, and the most important." As summer break approached, Isaiah couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened since his arrival. Teaching had always been a calling for him, but this year had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't easy standing up to bullies or navigating the complexities of small-town dynamics. Yet, through it all, he'd discovered something profound. True strength wasn't about winning battles, it was about building bridges. Every interaction, every challenge was an opportunity to connect, to inspire, and to grow. On the last day of school, Isaiah stood in the doorway of his classroom, watching as students filed out into the warm sunshine. Some stopped to thank him, while others simply waved goodbye. Among them were the 3 boys who had once tried to intimidate him. Now they shook his hand firmly, their expressions filled with gratitude and determination. "Thanks for believing in us," the stocky boy said, his voice thick with emotion. "We wouldn't be here without you." Isaiah smiled warmly, patting him on the back. "You did the work, don't forget that." Later that evening, as Isaiah drove home beneath a sky painted orange and pink by the setting sun, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He didn't know what the future held, for him or for the students whose lives he'd touched, but he knew one thing for certain: change was possible. It might not happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was worth fighting for. When he pulled into his driveway, Isaiah stepped out of the car and took a moment to breathe in the cool evening air. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the distant chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, children laughed as they played outside, their joy carrying through the twilight. For Isaiah, teaching wasn't just a job, it was a mission. A mission to remind others that they were capable of greatness, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. As he unlocked the door to his house and stepped inside, he carried that belief with him, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in the end, life wasn't about avoiding storms. It was about learning to dance in the rain,